Hello everyone, I hope you're having a calm and meaningful day. Today we're revisiting a moment when Tu Tieu and Uri come together to congratulate James and Tu Diep on their wedding. They meet as friends who have known each other for years, as a married couple, and as people who share mutual respect through time and experience. This is a quiet story about clarity, kindness, and how healthy connections can feel simple and natural. Stay with us, and let's reflect on moments where understanding itself becomes healing. Tu Diep sat alone at the long wooden table, a printed guest list spread neatly in front of her. She held a pen but wasn't writing. Instead, her eyes moved slowly down the names, familiar faces she and James had agreed on weeks ago. Family, close friends, colleagues, everything was already decided, yet she paused when she reached the section marked Friends. There was a small empty space there, not because she had forgotten anyone, but because she had deliberately left it open. She leaned back slightly, exhaling, and the names came to her naturally, Uri and Tu Tieu. They weren't people she spoke to every day anymore, but they had never disappeared from her life either. They were the kind of friends who remained quietly present, even when time and distance created gaps. A married couple she had known for years, long enough that their presence felt familiar rather than symbolic. Thinking of them didn't stir conflict or hesitation. It felt simple, almost obvious, yet she wanted to be honest with herself before writing their names down. This isn't complicated, she thought. It's just an invitation. James noticed her stillness before she said anything. He was standing nearby, checking messages on his phone, but he had learned to recognize the moments when her thoughts slowed. "You're stuck," he said casually, not looking up. Tu Diep smiled faintly. "Not stuck, just thinking." He walked over and glanced at the list. "About?" "I was thinking of inviting Uri and Tu Tieu," she said, her tone even. "I realized I hadn't written them down yet." James didn't react with surprise. He nodded once as if she had mentioned the most natural thing in the world. "That makes sense. They're your friends. And yours," she added. "Yes," he agreed. "Uri and I worked together for years. It would be strange not to invite them." She studied his face for a moment, checking not for approval, but for alignment. What she saw was calm certainty. "I didn't want it to feel awkward," she said quietly. "Not for anyone." James met her gaze. "It won't. You're not inviting them for a reason other than wanting them there." "That's exactly it," she said, relieved. "Then do it," he said simply. That settled it. Later that afternoon, Tu Diep picked up her phone and dialed Tu Tieu first. It felt instinctive, like reaching out to a friend she hadn't seen in a while but trusted completely. "Diep?" Tu Tieu's voice came through, surprised but warm. "Hey," Tu Diep said, smiling. "Do you have a minute?" "For you always," Tu Tieu replied lightly. They exchanged a few quick updates. Nothing dramatic, just life moving forward in ordinary ways. Then Tu Diep got to the point. "I wanted to invite you and Uri," she said. "James and I are getting married next month." There was a brief pause on the line, the kind that wasn't heavy, just unexpected. "Oh," Tu Tieu said, then laughed softly. "I didn't realize the date was that close. I'm really happy for you." "I wasn't sure if," Tu Diep began, then stopped herself. "I mean, I'd really like you both to come." Tu Tieu didn't hesitate. "Of course. Thank you for thinking of us. Truly." "No pressure," Tu Diep said. "I just wanted it to feel natural." "It does," Tu Tieu replied. "We'd love to be there." "I'll send you the details," Tu Diep said. "I'll come with Uri," Tu Tieu added easily, as if that had never been in question. After hanging up, Tu Diep felt a quiet sense of ease, There was no emotional residue, no unspoken tension, just the warmth of a conversation that landed exactly where it should. She waited a short while before calling Uri, mostly to avoid catching him in the middle of work. When he answered, his tone was relaxed. "Diep," he said, "what's up?" "I wanted to officially invite you and Tu Tieu," she said. "James and I are getting married." Uri chuckled. "I was wondering when that call would come. Congratulations, that's great news." "I hope it's not inconvenient," she said. "Not at all," he replied. "We'll be there. Just tell us when and where." She gave him the details, and he asked a few practical questions: time, parking, whether it was formal or relaxed. Nothing more. After the call ended, Tu Diep sat quietly for a moment, phone resting in her hand. There was no lingering anxiety. Everything had unfolded exactly as it should have. That evening, James glanced at his phone and smiled. "Uri just messaged me," he said. "He asked if I still remember that old project deadline we almost missed." Tu Diep laughed. "Do you?" "Unfortunately, yes," James replied. "We were younger and much more stressed." They exchanged a few messages with Uri, briefly reminiscing about late nights, impossible timelines, and how none of it seemed as urgent in hindsight. The tone was light, professional, friendly, like two people who had worked well together and moved on without unresolved business. As the days passed, Tu Tieu and Uri prepared to attend with the same mindset they approached most social gatherings: present, respectful, uncomplicated. They didn't rehearse conversations or anticipate emotional moments. To them, it was a celebration hosted by friends. On the morning they were due to go, Tu Tieu adjusted her outfit in the mirror and glanced at Uri. "Comfortable?" she asked. "Enough," he said. "You?" She nodded. "I think it'll be nice." "It will," Uri agreed. "They seem happy." "And that's all that matters," she said. When they arrived, they came together, naturally, as they always did. Tu Diep spotted them almost immediately and walked over with a genuine smile. "Tu Tieu," she said, opening her arms. Tu Tieu hugged her briefly. "You look good," she said, meaning it in the simplest sense. Healthy, settled, present. Uri followed with a handshake and a friendly nod. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you for coming," Tu Diep replied. "I'm really glad you're here." James joined them moments later, greeting Uri with familiarity. "It's been a while," he said. "Too long," Uri replied. "But you haven't changed much." "That's debatable," James said with a grin. The four of them stood together, talking easily. No one dominated the conversation, no one felt out of place. It felt less like a formal event and more like a quiet reunion of people who had known each other through different phases of life and had managed to keep those connections intact. As the conversation drifted to lighter topics, Tu Diep looked around briefly, then back at them, feeling certain of one thing. Inviting them had never been a risk. It was simply the continuation of a relationship that had always been grounded in clarity and respect. Nothing more, nothing less. Uri and Tu Tieu arrived together, their steps naturally in sync, not because they were performing anything, but because years of shared life had shaped an unspoken rhythm between them. They did not scan the room with hesitation or curiosity. There was no sense of entering unfamiliar territory. This was simply a place where people they knew were gathered, and that was enough. Tu Diep noticed them almost immediately. She felt no rush of emotion, no spike of uncertainty, only a calm recognition. She walked toward them with a relaxed smile, stopping at a comfortable distance before speaking. "You came," she said, her voice warm but steady. Tu Tieu smiled back. "Of course," she replied. It felt right. The two women stepped closer and embraced briefly, naturally, without formality or restraint. It was the kind of hug that did not try to prove closeness, only acknowledged it. When they stepped back, Tu Diep turned to Uri. She extended her hand openly. "It's good to see you," she said. Uri accepted the gesture with a firm handshake. "It's good to see you too," he answered. "Congratulations to both of you." His tone was calm, sincere, and uncomplicated. There was no pause that needed filling, no history that demanded explanation. James joined them moments later. He nodded slightly toward Uri, recognition passing between them without ceremony. "It's been a while," James said. Uri nodded in return. "It has," he replied, "but it doesn't feel distant." Their exchange was brief, shaped by shared experience rather than emotion. They did not revisit the past. They did not need to. Tu Tieu gently redirected the moment. "So," she said, looking at James, "how's life treating you these days?" James considered the question, then answered honestly. He spoke about work, about learning when to slow down, about choosing balance instead of constant urgency. Tu Tieu listened attentively, nodding as if she recognized the process. "That shift happens quietly," she said. "You don't notice it until you're already living differently." The four of them soon found themselves standing together in an easy formation, close enough to share conversation, far enough to respect personal space. No one felt placed at the center. No one felt peripheral. There was no tension to manage, no unspoken roles to navigate. It felt like a simple meeting between adults who understood where they stood. Their conversations stayed grounded. They spoke about routines, about how time seemed to move differently now, about small habits that had become meaningful without announcement. Uri mentioned an old project he and James had once worked on. "I still remember how convinced we were that we'd miss that deadline," he said with a small smile. James laughed quietly. "And how we stayed up half the night trying to fix it." The memory drew a shared smile, nothing more than a moment of recognition. Tu Diep listened, letting the scene settle around her. She felt a sense of confirmation rather than relief. Inviting them had not required courage. It had required honesty. And honesty, she realized, often feels lighter than anticipated. Tu Tieu felt comfortable in a way that surprised her slightly. She had expected neutrality, perhaps polite distance. Instead, she felt ease. Standing there, she understood that some friendships do not need constant maintenance to remain intact. They only need clarity. Uri felt the same. There were no invisible boundaries pressing against him, no expectations he needed to meet. He was not measured against the past, nor compared to the present. He was simply there, acknowledged as a friend, a partner, a professional peer. That simplicity allowed him to relax fully. James observed the group quietly. He noticed the absence of tension, the absence of performance. This, he thought, was what maturity often looked like when no one was trying to define it. It was not loud. It did not demand recognition. It simply existed. The surrounding gathering continued to flow around them. Voices rose and fell. People moved in and out of conversation. The four of them adjusted naturally, letting others join briefly, then stepping back into their own space. Nothing felt forced. Nothing lingered longer than it should. At one point, Uri glanced toward Tu Tieu, a small signal shared between them. She nodded slightly. "We should probably head out soon," she said. Uri agreed. "Yes," he said, "before it gets too late." They turned back to Tu Diep and James. "Thank you for inviting us," Tu Tieu said sincerely. "It was really good to see you." "I'm glad you came," Tu Diep replied. James added, Let's not wait too long before catching up again. Uri smiled. I'd like that. They said their goodbyes without ceremony. No prolonged pauses, no emotional punctuation, just warmth, exchanged and released. Uri and Tu Tieu walked away together, their pace unhurried, their presence leaving behind a sense of completion rather than absence. After they left, Tu Diep and James stood quietly for a moment. They did not rush to fill the silence. James spoke first. That went exactly how it should have. Tu Diep nodded. Yes, she said. Simple, clear. They shared a brief smile. Neither of them felt the need to analyze the moment further. The meaning was already understood. Being able to maintain old connections without confusion or tension was not something to celebrate loudly. It was something to appreciate quietly. As the evening continued, the moment blended into the larger flow of the gathering, but the understanding remained. Keeping relationships healthy, respectful, and well-defined was not about cutting ties or holding on. It was about allowing people to exist in their rightful places. And in that quiet realization, both Tu Diep and James felt steady, grounded, and at peace, knowing that growth did not always arrive with dramatic change, but often with calm acceptance, gentle clarity, and the confidence to let things be exactly what they were meant to be. At a quiet wedding gathering, Tu Diep calmly decides to invite longtime friends Uri and Tu Tieu, trusting clarity over hesitation. James supports the choice without question, recognizing shared history and mutual respect. The invitations are received warmly, without drama or expectation. When the couple arrives, interactions unfold with ease, brief hugs, handshakes, light conversation, and practical reminiscence. No one performs a role or revisits the past. Everyone stands comfortably in the present. Tu Diep feels confirmation rather than relief, realizing honesty is lighter than fear. Uri and Tu Tieu experience the same simplicity, welcomed as friends and peers. James observes the absence of tension as a sign of maturity. The meeting ends naturally with sincere goodbyes and no lingering weight. The moment blends into the celebration, affirming that healthy relationships endure through respect and clear boundaries with mutual trust.